Since the end of the last ice age, when both man and wildlife recolonised the British Isles, our relationship with the natural world has been a complex and interdependent one. What at first glance may appear to be our wild and natural landscape has in fact been shaped, directly or indirectly, by the activities of man, by the animals we've chosen to domesticate, the crops we've chosen to plant, and the places we've chosen to live, use for sustenance, power and recreation. Nowhere are the subtle changes to this ecological balancing act more keenly felt than in our lakes and rivers. For generations, anglers in the UK have been at the forefront of environmental campaigns. With an estimated 4 million participants, their continued presence provides a vital sentinel role. But there's a growing sense of alarm amongst some of the nation's most avid water watchers. They believe that hidden below the surface and out of view of the general public, the freshwater ecosystem is tilting dangerously out of balance. The reasons are complex and varied, but what is undeniable is that we ignore them at our peril. Firstly, water pollution, particularly rainwater runoff from agricultural land, continues to be a significant problem. Then there's the abstraction of water by water companies, often from some of our most delicate river systems. And thirdly, there's the long-term implications of climate change. But it's the interaction of predators at both ends of the food chain which has caused some of the most visibly apparent changes over a disturbingly short period of time. This is the signal crayfish. Introduced from North America in the 1970s by the British government for export to the lucrative Scandinavian food market, they soon escaped from commercial fisheries and began to decimate the native crayfish population through disease and over-competition. Once common in English and Welsh rivers, the white-claw crayfish is now classified as endangered and at risk of global extinction. Burrowing up to 2 meters into riverbanks, signal crayfish cause erosion and collapse. They increase sediment pollution, flood risk, and affect livestock safety, as well as threatening the habitat of endangered riverside species such as Britain's water vole. But their impact is far greater than that. These voracious predators feed on a variety of plants, invertebrates, amphibians, fish, and most worryingly, fish eggs. Their effects on native fish stocks already under pressure from other factors can be devastating, for without eggs, the future fish population is effectively being wiped out. Their high reproductive rate and lifespan of up to 20 years, combined with the ability to cover several hundred meters over land in one night, have all contributed to their catastrophic effect. This has in some areas been compounded by what in normal circumstances would be seen as a success story. Although often perceived as seabirds, cormorants have always been found inland in Britain, but numbers have been controlled since medieval times. In the 19th century, some species had all but disappeared in many parts of Europe. However, since the 1980s, there's been a dramatic increase in all cormorant populations, with best estimates for European numbers at around 500,000, and continuing to increase in many countries. The most recent estimates for the UK suggest there are approximately 9,000 breeding pairs, of which about 1,600 pairs nest inland. However, when young offspring and overwintering birds are taken into account, this rises to a peak figure of up to 30,000 in autumn months. This rise in the population is due to a number of factors, including far greater protection, the banning of many pesticides, and the increased number of man-made waters such as flooded gravel pits, reservoirs, and recreational fisheries. So what impact do they have? Well, as with any predator, cormorants attempt to catch the necessary quantity of food with a minimum amount of effort. An adult bird consumes on average half a kilo of fish per day. But because they often gather in such large numbers, in smaller contained waters, they can reduce the number of mature fish below the level required to maintain a viable, self-sustaining population. And for species such as salmon, already under critical pressure, the effect of a large colony of cormorants on young salmon ready to migrate out to sea, which are known as smolt, represents a significant threat to their existence. A study made in the Foyle catchment showed that over the course of a 6-week smolt run, the predatory cormorant population would be responsible for removing over 130,000 salmon smolt and over 90,000 brown trout from the area. This level of predation represents the removal of almost half of the total population of migrating smolt, and some put the figure as high as 2/3. In some rivers, another bird, the goosander, is also giving cause for concern. First seen in the UK in the 1870s, the numbers of overwintering members of this fish-eating species are now estimated to be around 12,000, and their predatory effect on already declining salmon populations is alarming many. Perhaps no other creature represents the dilemma faced by conservationists more than the otter. Once widespread across the UK, by the late 1970s, there were concerns that the otter population in England would completely disappear. As with cormorants, a key factor was the use of pesticides, which, as they make their way up through the food chain, hit apex predators the hardest. During the 80s and 90s, over 160 animals were released back into the wild. Today there's a thriving population, thought to number several thousand, and it's an indication of just how resilient and prolific they are that once certain toxic pesticides were banned, the descendants of those released otters form only a tiny proportion of the overall population. Otters are opportunistic feeders, and although usually 75 to 95% of their diet is fish, they also eat amphibians, crayfish, small mammals, and, often surprising to many, birds. Indeed, ground nesting birds are particularly vulnerable, and it's interesting to note that an increasing number of RSPB reserves are erecting fences to protect rare bird species that are themselves under threat. But a key aspect of their feeding habit is causing growing concern for the nation's anglers. Their marked preference for live prey means that no matter how large the creature they catch may be, once they've had their fill, rather than return to the carcass at a later date, an otter will use its formidable hunting skills to catch again. In a flourishing river with plenty of small fish, their impact will be negligible and their presence a blessing. But in a river whose fish population is already suppressed by other factors, it's a very different story. Where their presence can be truly devastating is in contained bodies of water, as many operators of commercial fish farms and owners of prize ornamental fish have found to their cost. For recreational fisheries, the problem is compounded further by the size of the lakes that need protecting. The sight of large fish, some of which are over 40 years old, which have fallen victim to otter predation, is becoming increasingly common. With some specimens valued in the tens of thousands, the economic impact can be enormous. In 2011, it was estimated that in Yorkshire alone, the cost of replacing carp weighing over £10 that had been lost in fisheries due to otter predation was over £2.75 million. Many owners, in an effort to protect their livelihood, have been forced to erect special fencing. But for an individual or small business, this can be hugely expensive, and it's also disruptive to other large wild mammals. Ultimately, how we choose to protect our wildlife is a subjective decision, and this gets to the heart of a very difficult, complicated, and often highly political balancing act. Right now, many in the angling world feel that things have reached crisis point, for without healthy and financially sustainable rivers, lakes and fisheries, there's a real fear that the long-term future of recreational angling is under threat. So why should anyone be bothered? Well, in England and Wales alone, 4 million anglers spend around £3 billion every year, providing employment for thousands of people, ranging from biologists to river bailiffs, tackle manufacturers to tour guides. In certain rural areas, particularly in Scotland, trout and salmon fishing is vital to the local economy. But fish stocks are facing unsustainable pressure at both ends of the food chain, and the statistics make for sobering reading. In 2015, an EA study revealed that a mere 17% of English rivers had a good ecological status, and only a tiny fraction of them were deemed to be high quality. That same year, the EA released around 2.5 million fish into our freshwater systems. However, it's estimated that overwintering birds alone will consume 6 million. And Environment Agency studies reveal that the number of fry in British rivers is at its lowest ever level. Meanwhile, the World Wildlife Fund estimates that a quarter of England's rivers are at risk of running dry, with devastating consequences for wildlife. Now, it would be very easy to dismiss this as the blinkered moaning of a self-interested group of people who are obsessed with catching fish at the expense of all else. But the overwhelming majority of the millions of people that go fishing cherish the fragile and complex ecosystem in which they choose to spend so much time. They're passionate about protecting our varied British wildlife. And spending so much time by the water's edge, they're often the first to notice the telltale signs of alarm. Now, anglers don't profess to have all the answers, and they're certainly not proposing a mass cull of otters and cormorants. But what they are asking for is help, and for this to be taken seriously. Doing nothing is just not an option. It puts at risk not only many thousands of jobs, but most importantly, the very future of a diverse and thriving natural environment.